So let me just try and organize these cards. I'm going to start with a question that I thought was kind of philosophical, and I think it's actually kind of appropriate for everybody to answer, including the philosopher. And that is that we heard several times that in presentations, particularly the first two presentations, that taste was a unique element and yet critical. And the question is, haven't fast food people and food chemists been working on this to push sugar and salt and find ways in which to make taste kind of an objective measurement? And then the sort of philosophical question behind that is there a taste arms race coming between fast food and chemical food chemists and people trying to make more sustainable food taste better? Everybody want to respond to that, or whoever would like to? Go. Oh, sorry.
I'm always wary when marketing and philosophy come together. That seems an unholy alliance. I think it's probably I mean, in some sense, yes. I mean, we know that one of the growing trends in the food industry is customizability, and so it's the way that companies or dining service professionals are going to be able to not only understand the tastes that are going to get people to eat their product, but are also going to allow particularly younger generations to feel that they're creating something that to some extent is their own and expresses their personality. So there's a way in which I think that realization is certainly in play. As academics, of course, we don't quite have the array of tools and the financial support that sometimes the commercial operations do. And so that's the challenge. That's been, I think, in many ways, maybe Michael Pollan that Christopher brought up at the beginning of his talk. I mean, is very onto this idea that the individual struggle that we have as eaters, or parents have trying to get their kids perhaps to eat a certain way, they're up against teams of sensory scientists, psychologists, marketers, when they're trying to influence good eating habits. So how do we, take the broader approach and make sure that there are more opportunities for individuals to see the possibilities that are out there and to use them into their own eating habits?
A different point of view, I guess, but a different area is, I think, with the revolution that we talked about in crop genetics and breeding, there's a renewed focus on taste, and with the technologies of CRISPR, with bringing in more of wild varieties, there's examples are certainly the apples, which we've noticed are much better, they're crispier, they're tastier, and a major focus of tomato also. There are many tomato researchers that are pioneering using CRISPR technology and succeeding to improve both all the sensory, flavor, smell, the whole thing. So I think that, we're going to have to rely less in the future on additives, because I think our natural foods are going to taste a lot better because of the precision of breeding.
Okay, great. Ro, any opinion? Christopher?
Well, it's interesting. All the fast food places have executive chefs, so they use fat, salt, and sugar to make things taste good, be inexpensive, and so what the Culinary Institute of America and the Humanities of Change are doing are bringing those chefs and challenging them to do that with other than fast food, and not do just salt, fat, and sugar. So we have a really fascinating experience with the Silicon Valley company that will go unmentioned for now. They have a ton of money, and they have a ton of chefs, and they provide free food, and we get all the chefs together from actually across the U.S., and they have a 3-finger rule for salt, if you don't know this. So a pinch of salt is 3 fingers. And we were sort of documenting how often they put 3 fingers of salt in the dishes they were making. They were kind of oblivious to it. It was like breathing. And we asked them to track it, and we said, come up with some things. And as a team, online, we had these sessions with them. And this is actually a focus on hypertension in the company, which was a cost for them. So their workers were getting hypertension. sodium is clearly related. They came up with a battery of optional spice blends that as chefs they tasted that were better than the salt. And so this is part of their tasting. Engage the chefs and recognize salt's easy, it's really cheap, but use them for their craft to make easy, inexpensive foods, whatever. So the field is moving in this direction. So it's not a race to the bottom against the fast food companies. It's engaging them all in this idea of a more sophisticated palate and taste, which is pretty fun.
Great. Okay.
I did think of something.
Okay.
Which is, there's another way to introduce good tasting, fresh vegetables to people, which is have them help grow them. So my experience at the farm is we're growing vegetables and people pull a carrot out of the ground and they eat it and they go, oh my God, that's the best carrot I've ever had in my life. That's the best tomato I've ever eaten. The bonding that happens in the field affects how they eat.
Great. Thank you. Susan, question for you. Is there an effort to coordinate throughout the university to overhaul science education?
A little bit. Through at UC Riverside, in the UC system, there really needs to be a lot more focus on it. I know that's the HHMI has funded a project that is going on in UC Santa Barbara, UC Santa Cruz, UC Riverside, and UC Berkeley to improve the teaching of science. So in terms of plant science and in terms of teaching the science, there's more going on, but there's not the funding there to support it. And I think the other thing also is that the other place we need change is in the tenure and promotion process. So there is, and UC is probably better than most university systems, although there still is this intense focus on research, which is important, but it shouldn't be exclusive. And especially now when government grants, federal grants, are so difficult to get. I mean, when I got my first NIH grant, it was like a 28% pay line. It's down to like 5% now, which means that 95% of people don't get their proposals, don't get their proposals funded. And so we really need, as a university, and as faculty, we need to begin to change the rules and begin to appreciate the importance of training the next generation rather than sort of eking out a few graduate students and postdocs, which is really the total focus of promotion and tenure.
Okay. Raul, this question for you. Most of your practices require much more labor than conventional farming, affecting prices. How do you practice organic practices without increasing food prices, which affect the poorest people?
So that's always been a challenge for organic farming. It does take more labor. It does take more energy to make compost, bring it. There are more expensive practices. And I've been stumped by this until this meeting when I realized that somewhat lower yields and that might be associated with improving the environmental impact of agriculture and slightly higher prices are going to be offset by the low-cost insect food that we'll all eat over the long run. I don't have a great answer for it. I think that farming more carefully does cost more, and people will have to pay for that.
Great, thank you. Christopher, a question from the board. Change eating behaviors, you mentioned several levers. With the lever of mass media and infomercial nutrition entrepreneurs that reach the masses, how does the everyday person make informed decisions?
That's a pretty complicated question. We have visual learners, people who like to read, see pictures. Yeah, I'm going to be stumped. That's part of our education process. We should be more critical. So I'll flip it on its head and say, food is an incredible educational tool. It's legal, it's business, it's math, it's social studies. So I would love to see in K-12 or college just food used as a better lever, as a teaching tool. We have more critical people. It's accessible to everybody. They eat. So if you want to think how to be critical, how to think of science critically, food is a perfect venue for teachers to wrap their heads around. At the university environment, one of the epiphanies for me was that all alone with my health domain, I'm kind of useless. But if I pull in the law school, the business school, the med school, earth sciences, etc. So I don't know, I see it as everybody can cook together, talk together around the dinner table. So for the everyday person, they're completely disconnected from food right now. So the opportunity, if you reconnected them with food, we'd have more culture, we'd have more time with our families at the table, we could talk about being critical about things that are confusing. I don't have the perfect answer for that. I'm just going to say it's a perfect opportunity to make some important changes in the country, and maybe our congressional leaders would talk more at their table too. Okay, sorry, let's not go into that.
Okay, great. So Robert, question for you. Classic American cuisine is an artifact of the last couple of generations in European descent middle class, and maybe not even representative of that. Can other cultural perspectives inform the changes in cuisine that you're talking about?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's essential to do that. I mean, sort of piggybacking off of Christopher's response, I think a lot of what we can leverage in these efforts is just trying to get students, but I think everyone, aware that what appears as a natural norm is something that has distinct cultural and historical origins. So it's something that's contingent rather than necessary, and thus it can be changed. Oftentimes when it has the veneer of something that is static and fixed, then one feels powerless in the face of it. So in many ways, the sort of majority cuisine operates in that way. The habits in ways that chefs are sometimes trained, and that educators are trained to teach their subject and what they teach in their courses. All these things appear as unchanging monoliths sometimes. So the more that we can open that up and show that for students, there's not just a diversity out there, but that diversity can become the norm if we create the conditions where that's allowed to happen. So a dining hall is a perfect place to do that. We did a project a couple of years ago where one of my students took Christopher's stealth health approach and wanted to get more plant-forward cuisine into the dining hall, but knew that plant-forward cuisine was not going to resonate with students. And so she used various cuisines from around the world as a vehicle to introduce plant-forward cuisine, because what for us seems plant-forward and novel to many cuisines around the world is just the way that they eat all of the time. It also infused more flavor into the cuisine. It allowed our international students to engage with some of their peers in a way that they hadn't been able to before, and that personal connection. So this wasn't something top-down that chefs or some philosophy professor was telling you to eat. Their peers on campus were sharing with them their foods in the same way that they would love to share their foods with students that they meet for the first time. So all those kinds of factors, I think, open up the possibilities. We know that we love choices. I think when we think about what we're doing or trying to do in the dining hall compared to fast food, I like to think that we're giving them real choices. So we're not just giving them 20 varieties of the same fat, sugar, and salt. We're actually giving them real differences where they can find flavors and tastes that are interesting and eye-opening sometimes to them.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to do one more round of questions for each of you, and then I'm going to ask each of you to ask a question if you have it of one of the other panelists, and then we'll close with the phrase or sentence that you really want people to remember from your presentation. So one more round for each of you. Let's start with Raul with this question up here. Are big agrochemical lab tech companies like Monsanto and Bayer part of the sustainable future?
I think if they develop sustainable products, they're part of the sustainable future. So if they develop products that reduce pesticide use, that reduce soil erosion, that reduce nitrate leaching, that improve nutrients in crops, that provide disease resistance and nematode resistance, then yeah, that's part of the future.
Okay. So Christopher, for you, does the average protein consumption figure mask huge variations? Are there some who consume truly gigantic amounts of protein that we need to figure out how to deal with?
Yeah, there's the buffed, ripped dudes who are just completely confused with their soy protein powder. So I'm not quite sure exactly what the question was. There is a range. The more striking thing is actually across the globe how narrow the average range is. It's really small. Everybody in the world eats like 10 to 15% protein on average. Within any country, there's obviously going to be somebody at a high and a low extreme. Sorry, I'm going to reframe it just because I don't like to answer questions that I can't answer. There's a very pretty famous weight loss study where the goal is to get people to eat 25% versus 15% protein. And at the end of this 800-person, multi-bazillion-dollar study, the people assigned to eat 25% protein were eating 21, and the people assigned to eat 15 were eating 20. They were given completely different directions for eating food, and at the end of the 2 years, they were almost identical. So I see people saying how much protein they eat. It's really a pretty narrow range. Your palate gets satiated, and you move on, and you need something else. So it's really, I know you're just asking like how wide the range is. I'm actually struck how narrow it is. It's pretty consistent across the globe.
Great, thanks. Susan, let's turn to this question. Do you think faculty get rewarded enough for working in applied and translational research focused on sustainability?
I have no idea. I mean, I think it all depends on individual researchers. It's how successful you are at getting outside grant funds. I think that there is, I think if we bring it back to the question that I can answer, is that there isn't sufficient grant funding in this area. And so, you know, if faculty go sort of go in the direction of where they can be funded. And so since there is, like I said, decreasing funding in plant sciences, in agriculture, I mean, dramatically decreasing funding. Like I said, our funding was almost cut in half this year by NSF, and nobody notices. So no, I think it's not just sustainability, it's all areas. I think that one, you know, some of our best students that are interested in sustainability, interestingly, are interested in like Costa Rica, or in rainforests and what have you, and they don't realize that the major ecosystem in this world is agriculture. And I just wish we could get them more interested in that, because these are some of our best students. And then when they graduate, they find there are no jobs in the areas they're interested in, when in agriculture there's tons of jobs. So somehow we got to get that message across, that agriculture is hugely impactful on people's lives. And I know certainly that message has resonated here at this meeting, and I hope that we can figure out ways to get students more interested in this.
Great. That's a good point, I think, about the students wanting to get something accomplished, but it turns out you really need to work on this other area in order to actually make it happen. It's an extraordinarily important thing for people to learn. So, Robert, the question for you is, how do we get the private sector more engaged with diet change? How do we get them engaged in the kind of things that you're talking about?
Private sector in what sense?
In the sense of the non-university, I think.
I mean, are we thinking like business and corporate, or just average everyday people? There's a large swath, right? So in my presentation today, I talked primarily about how on the Minis of Change University Research Collaborative, academics like myself are working with dining service professionals on how we're trying to make those things happen. There, you know, in the broader structure of MCURC, there are the founding corporate sponsors, and so there's corporate sponsors who are interested in the kind of research that we're doing, and you know, want their forward kind of facing identity to be attached in some way to the work that we're doing. I mean, I think ultimately, it's a tough question to answer. I might make the move that my collaborators up here have made and adjust the question a little bit. I mean, I think that's ultimately what we're all trying to do. I mean, you know, in terms of the work in the dining hall, I think our long vision goal is that our students change their habits for the better, for themselves and for the planet, and that translates into the choices they make for themselves throughout life, for their children throughout life. It's the message that they bring to people around them, and it'll be part of, you know, what happens on the university. I don't buy into the classic notion that, oh, well, you know, in college is not the real world. You know, that living laboratory model is, if there's a difference, it's what we're trying to do is allow students the room to make those mistakes where they won't be penalized, but those mistakes will actually be an integral part of the learning process, so that when they do enter into the quote-unquote real world, maybe they're less afraid of making mistakes because we all do it, and they're more prepared to rebound from those mistakes. So I think everything that we're doing here on campuses is essential to what goes on. And of course, that goes for scholars and academics as well. We need that freedom on campuses ourselves in the process of not just making mistakes in the research that we do, but also in the choices that we make, whether it's about sustainability, you know, what's driving the kinds of things that we can research on campus. The more open and free that is, I think the better that is for that connection between the academic sector and the private sector ultimately. So.
Thank you. So now I'm going to ask each of you if you have a question for one of the other members of this panel. So can we start with you?
Yeah, I was wondering, with all the student surveys that you did about food and what have you, if GMOs came up.
Trying to think if we actually did a study about, I think one of the questions in the tasting table had to, I have to go back to that survey, might have had to do with the question of organic versus conventionally raised, something like, I don't think there was a distinct GMO question on there. I know in teaching that question in a variety of places, whether it's in my ethics class or my environmental ethics class, or with my food research students, I'm always, I think, surprised by the variety of, I won't say lack of information or misinformation, just the variety of stories that students and adults have about what GMOs are, where they are, what foods are possibly GMO and which ones will never be GMO, all of those kinds of questions. So it seems that there's definitely not the right information out there, and whether that means that we should move more towards them or away from them, and that's, you know, if you want to have that kind of healthy debate, you need the sort of ground floor of facts to be there, and that seems to be generally missing, unfortunately.
So, do you have a question that you'd like to ask me?
I do, and it'll go right back to Susan. I'm curious, as a kind of, you know, in your presentation, I thought it was that idea of teaching that science is not simply about the facts, but it's about, you know, the investigation and the exploration into the things that we don't know, and creating that sort of lab introductory to science, to do the real work of science, if you will. Have you reached beyond that? You know, as part of the crisis of getting the students you want into the sciences, have you reached out of the natural sciences into the social and the sciences and the humanities? To break down, what I see in a lot of my students too is that science students think that what we do in the humanities is all wishy-washy, and that humanities students think that, oh, those scientists, well, they're just locked into, you know, this tiny box and they can't think outside of it. So are there ways that you're also trying to dissolve that barrier to bring more students potentially into both?
It's a really good question. I think the only place we do it sort of purposefully is when we bring in the business side of science, and we talk about how things get funded. What are the problems that can be solved by science, I guess, like real problems in the world? So I guess the answer to your question is really no. I mean, we talk about genetically modified organisms, or we talk about the ethical issues with that, or not so. But I can say that when I started teaching my course at the University of Georgia, it was for non-science majors, and it was for upper class non-science majors, and it was a disaster. Okay, because the one thing in science that you take for granted with your students is that they're interested. Okay, they're really interested. These students had no interest, and you had to convince them that science was important because they were upperclassmen. So that's the only experience, and I guess that really turned me off to. Then we decided to focus. Let's focus at the freshman level, and the ones who were really interested first. So no, but I think that's a really good question.
Yes, I have personal nutritional advice that I'd like to ask Christopher. You showed a slide of recommended protein amounts over weight, different weights. I would have thought it was more useful to show protein requirements over age. And I wondered if you had incorporated that thinking into.
Ro, when you get our paper next week, we have summarized all the dietary guidelines, and it's fascinatingly similar. So in little kids, the RDA, as low as infants, goes up to like 1.1 grams per day, as opposed to 0.8. And then it sort of drops from 1.1 to 1.0 to 0.95 to 0.8. And then as you get elderly, people are pushing for 1.0. It's all extremely similar. So in an older population, part of it is they're not eating as much, part of it is there's some sarcopenia involved, which is muscle loss. It is a little higher, given that Americans typically eat twice as much protein as they need. It's not that big a deal. But in older populations where they're not eating enough food, period, they've got gum disease, they've lost their appetite, they're not physically active, there is a push for more protein in that particular group. But it's not just protein, it's all the things going on in their life at the same time.
And then just slightly related to that is protein. I was thinking when you asked about where protein was stored, I would have thought, it's used to build muscle.
But that's a functional storage depot. So it is, but it's functional. So if you're going to draw from the store in time of need, you're going to lose muscle mass, which is what's happening in older people, and they're not as functionally capable to reach or to climb stairs or to get up from a chair. So I'm not calling that a storage depot unless you want to call it a functional storage depot. You wouldn't want to draw from that just like you don't want to draw from your bones for calcium. Sure, I need calcium in my blood, so I kept drawing. I broke my hip. Darn, from hip fracture because you had osteoporosis. Same kind of thing.
Hey, Christopher, you have a question.
Well, tit for tat, I'll go back to Raul. So I'm jealous of the UC system, maybe. So Janet Napolitano created the Global Food Challenge. I went to UCLA one time. I was fascinated with how many students were doing student farming and student gardens and vertical things. And so I'm curious at UC Davis, how aware are you of the UC Global Food Challenge? And how, is that something that's impacted your life since that got started, I think 2 or 3 years ago?
Yes, one of the main things that's happened at the student farm that's impacted me directly is that there's been funding from that to divert excess produce, seconds produce from the student farm to the food pantry on campus. And what was fascinating to me to start with was that the average, this goes dead sometimes, average income of families that have students at UC Davis is about $45,000 a year. So that means that if you're paying for your child to go to college, they don't have a lot of extra money. So there are quite a large number of food insecure students on every campus. And so the food pantry becomes a place for them to obtain fresh local produce at no cost. So in this past year, this program has diverted 20,000 pounds of produce from the student farm to the food pantry. And there are interns, there are a lot of people involved. And this question came up yesterday about whether diverting this food is cost effective, whether it would cost less just to buy the food for the food pantry. But I think the extra benefit you get from this, aside from reducing waste at the farm, is you get the education, the experiential education of the students participating in this that helps them, that helps make food insecurity really tangible for them. So I think that's been a very effective program at Davis in actually putting food on people's plates.
Thank you. So the last thing we're going to do is ask each one of you to say one phrase or one sentence that you want people to remember about what you had to say today.
Just one?
One sentence or one phrase.
Okay, I think the goal here is maximizing the intersection of human health and the health of the environment, and we have found that, and it just completely aligns.
I think integrated control of pests and integrated management strategies for soils is the long-term solution for sustainable agriculture.
I would say that if we could figure out how to connect our taste or the enjoyment of food to agency, we will empower a heck of a lot of people.
I think that sustainable agriculture is the most important problem of the 21st century.